Dragi gledatelji, gledate Spike, emisiju televizije Student. Danas u eri lažnih vijesti postavlja se pitanje što su to vijesti. Što je novinarstvo, a tko je publika? Kakve trebaju biti vijesti u doba kada notifikacije s pametnih telefona preplavljuju naše ekrane? Gdje je tu objektivnost, transparentnost i nepristranost? O ovim pitanjima razgovaramo sa dvoje profesora sa Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, sveučilišta u Arizoni, doktorom Billom Silcockom i Jacobom Nelsonom. Hello and welcome to our studio.
Good to be here.
You are here in Zagreb doing a two-week workshop with Croatian students. And can you tell us something about the workshop, your experience with working with the students?
Well, I've been coming to Croatia for 20 years, and this is the most exciting week we've had together the past couple of weeks, Dr. Nelson and myself. This workshop focuses on something very timely in Croatian society, which is the state of journalism today and the world of fake news of which we live in.
Exactly. That was my next question. Why was the project, the workshop, called News and Me?
That's a great title. I'm sure we'd have to ask other people, but I think because we want to focus on the fact that news is for the audience, and Dr. Nelson's research is very much focused on audience and how the audience engages with them. So it's the news and me, the individual, the person in society, as well as the individual watcher.
So what would you say news is in today's world? Are we just oversaturated with social media?
I think that the definition of news at this point is very much up for debate, which is one of the reasons why we made this the theme, because now that there's so much media that's available, people are unsure where to turn to for news and which news sources to trust, and as a result, people who actually work in journalism can no longer take for granted that people will just assume that they know what they're talking about. And so the short answer is that it means very different things to different people.
Yes. Professor Nelson, you work in the field of audience engagement. What would you say are some of the best ways to get your audience engaged with what you want to say to them?
So at this point, I would say that we're very much in the experimental phase of engaging with audiences. In fact, the very idea that journalists should be communicating with audiences is itself a very new idea that's being pursued. That being said, the techniques that seem to make the most intuitive sense are when journalists are very transparent and open with audiences about what it is that actually goes into creating journalism, and when they give audiences the opportunity to contribute not just at the end of an article in the comments, but in the reporting process as well.
The traditional news cycle of television is mostly gone now, and people just mostly consume media on their smartphones. And how can journalists still, in this climate, reach out to people? And do you need to be present all the time? Or is the story what ultimately grabs and gets to people?
This seems like a question for you.
Yeah, that's a great, tough question. So I think what you're asking is, how do the journalists keep up with the demand for stories today?
Yes, yes.
Boy, I think they struggle just as much as the audience does. I mean, I can be on my smartphone 24/7 and always worried that I've missed the next story. Journalists now are expected to do lots more. Instead of just going with a reporting crew to a protest rally, while they're there, they have to tweet about it, probably post to Instagram, sometimes do Facebook Live, where before they were just calmly doing the story and thinking about it as they went back to the station and having time in the newsroom. That's upside down. It's 24/7, we're always on, we're always live. That pace and intensity, I think, has an impact probably on how good a job journalists do, because there's not a lot of the routines of fact-checking that used to be there that were so important. But maybe the audience is playing a new role because they're the ones that's demanding all of this live stuff. And they'll very quickly tell us, hey, you did it wrong, or they'll jump on Facebook and make comments that you pronounced it wrong or something. It's a lot tougher to be a journalist today than when I first started.
What kind of news do you think people need or want, and what are the news that they get?
Wow, Jake will answer that in just a second, but I think people still want to know, is my world safe? Is my home and family safe? Like, is there some toxic pollution in my backyard, or is there some measles epidemic? So is my world safe? Is my home and family safe? Once they've answered those two questions, the third question they want to ask is, what in the last 24 hours has shocked or amused me? So then you get the story like the death of Elvis Presley or the death of Michael Jackson, or something else that's shocking and or amusing, and viral cat videos or whatever. They still fundamentally want to know, you know, was Russia and America about to drop the bomb on each other? But assuming for today, that's okay, World War III is not happening, then they care more about like their pocketbook, their health, and some of the other traditional things that make us want to watch what news is.
Yeah, I think that it's a very hard question to answer because it depends on how you're asking it. So I think that if you measure what audiences want from news by looking at what they click on, then what you typically see is they're clicking on very light and soft stories or cat videos and celebrity gossip. But if you ask them what they want, then what they typically say is they want political news and investigative journalism. And that makes it very confusing, and it makes you wonder, well, is it what they're actually clicking on, or is it what they say they want, and journalists are just not providing enough of it? Someone who I once read that does research on this wrote that the news that audiences need is just journalism that's useful, and I think that that encompasses all of those things.
I would like to ask you about the topic of fake news. How do you explain fake news to your students, and what are the dangers of fake news in today's society?
So I try to impress upon students that fake news, although a very popular topic now, is not something that's new. Journalists and people involved in news production have historically had incentives to make up information, both for political and economic reasons. The difference now is that many people believe that it's much worse because social media has created this environment where fake news stories can go viral, and people may not necessarily know that those sources of information are not credible. And that has made people much more nervous about what its implications are for society. And so when I discuss that with students, I just try to make sure that they understand that the phenomenon itself is not new, but the dangers of it now have some unique circumstances.
Yes, exactly. And historically, fake news were around before, but Donald Trump, the president of the United States, he basically, I would say, weaponized the word, right?
Yeah, so I think that that's a really good point. I think that it's very likely that politicians have always attempted to play favoritism with news that they like and sort of cast aspersions on news that may actually be true, but is critical of them. But at this point, because of how saturated the media environment is, and because it's much easier for people to pick favorites in terms of the news media sources that are available, it's created a very scary situation where politicians like Donald Trump can say that's fake about things that are actually true, and his supporters can agree with him and completely discount any real information that's coming from an otherwise credible source.
And I think the danger of that is the audiences are listening to each other. They're in this little echo chamber or in this little tribe, and once in a while they hear something outside of their circle and they may not believe it because people inside are saying, don't believe it, don't believe it. So in the past, where you could kind of trust that everybody was going to hear everything, that's not true anymore. And I think, you know, social media propels that, but the danger of that is they just start talking to each other, and somewhere the truth gets lost in all of this.
That's something I also noticed, is that people only consume the media that caters to their personal opinions and their attitudes about certain things. And how would you say, what can we as journalists do to reach out to those people who may not align with our opinions?
So there's actually a lot of research that shows that that's not exactly true, that people are actually exposed to information that does not align with their beliefs, mostly because if someone consumes news only from Facebook or from Google News searches, for example, those platforms tend to privilege whatever is popular. And as a result, people who may be very strongly liberal or conservative will still stumble on stories that don't align with those political beliefs. The issue, from my perspective, is not that they're in filter bubbles and they're not being exposed to it. It's that they've already made up their minds about how they feel about those stories. So as Bill was saying, if they stumble onto those stories, but they've already determined that what those stories are saying just can't possibly be true, then it makes it so that they don't even acknowledge really anything that comes out of those news outlets is true. So it's not necessarily just about getting those people to see content from those sources. It's solving this problem means somehow getting those people to trust that those sources could actually be credible.
What would you say are like the main ingredients for a really compelling story?
Well, it depends on the platform. If it's television, it's got to have video. It's video-driven. That's why they're watching. I think sometimes we forget how the important role that sound plays in any story. If it's on my phone, or but podcasts, which are something 10 years ago people said no one's going to sit on their phone and listen to these things, are just globally, phenomenally taken off, and people could care less about pictures. They just want sound. So, good sound, good pictures, compelling stories. Those haven't changed. I think they're still going to be with us, the way people watch and listen. But I think we live in the most exciting time. I mean, 5 years from now, I won't even have these 2 smartphones in my pocket. I'll have a Dick Tracy watch. In fact, I probably already could. But there'll be some new way of still telling stories. But there's an American documentary filmmaker named Ken Burns, and he has this wonderful phrase called electronic campfires, which is the idea that the cowboys in the West used to sit around the campfire at night and just tell stories. Well, we're still doing that. We're not in front of a campfire, or we're not a family 100 years ago in Croatia, telling stories. We're doing it in this electronic campfire thing. So I think stories are always here. Storytelling, is still important.
One of the things we always hear about journalists is that we should be objective and unbiased. Do you think that is still possible even in this day and age, and how do we keep our trust, our credibility on?
Well, there's a lot of words that we always banter: objectivity, fairness, balance, transparency. I believe it's virtually impossible for any journalist to be objective, and that's just true. A lot of times people say they're objective, and journalism schools teach it, and we write about it, but we also increasingly know every story I cover, I come to with some kind of bias. If I was doing an environmental story, I grew up in a home where my parents were both environmentalists. So I've been raised how evil mining companies are and how wonderful the Sierra Club is, or environmentalists. So I have to put checks and balances on myself to say, maybe the mining company has a point. That's where it's important in a newsroom to have lots of voices in the editorial process, kind of does a check on that idea of objectivity. But more importantly than objectivity maybe is, and this new word Dan Gilmore on our faculty has talked a lot about, is transparency, though, so that the audience knows, here's more about that journalist, so he may be bringing something to this story. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right. I think that pure objectivity has never been possible. And I think that part of the problem that journalism is facing now with this crisis of trust is that they have projected this image that they are objective without necessarily acknowledging just how impossible that pure objectivity actually is. And it's, as a result, made people think, well, you're biased and you're not admitting it. And so, as Bo was saying, I think that if journalists were to be maybe more transparent about what biases they may be bringing into a story, not necessarily even based on their own values, but also just based on their own limitations as reporters. If their sources are all politicians or police officers, for example, then their coverage of a community may be biased in that it's missing out on sort of local voices that they're not conveying. And so being a little bit more inward and self-reflective, and still maintaining the pursuit of objectivity while being aware of just how elusive that happens to be.
This is the most exciting time for journalism, because for the first time, we're trying to figure out how to get the audience involved in the conversation, to really do some listening. And we've had movements in America like public journalism, civic journalism. In Europe, they talk about constructive journalism, all these different words. That's part of what Jake's research is figuring out what role does the audience play in all this. But when I was a journalist, we didn't care. We know what the news is, we're going to give it to you. Now we're suddenly letting them in on the conversation. We're trying to figure out how do we do that while still maintaining what we are professionally done to do. I'll give you the medical example. We come from a teaching hospital model of journalism education at the Cronkite School. My grandma has the cure for some illness. Well, I'll listen to grandma, but if it's really not getting fixed, I need to go to the doctor. So the same as, I can listen to people doing social media, audience engagement stuff, but hopefully I'll go to a journalist if I want to get the right story who's trained professionally to do that.
Yeah, I agree. Dr. Bill, this is your 7th time in Croatia working with Croatian
Lucky
students.
number 7.
Yeah. And in your experience coming here and working with journalism students and just generally being present in Croatia, especially now with the journalist protests that happened just a couple days ago, what would you say are some similarities and what are some differences between journalism in Croatia and journalism in the United States?
It's a big, easy number one, and it's all over the building at the Cronkite School. You do not have a First Amendment. And having that First Amendment gives such power to us as journalists in the United States. So here you have all these lawsuits. I think there's over 1,000 lawsuits going on right now. Yeah, there's lawsuits in the United States, but not nearly to the degree that is. So one of the big differences is our First Amendment. But the other thing is, and you're right, this is a very tough time for journalists. They are under siege, really, by politicians, by the government, by the audience. So more importantly than ever before, they have to work on how to tell their story about what they do and why it's important to society so that the audience can tell the difference between a journalist, a fake news bot, and somebody else who's maybe not a journalist but just a blogger but kind of looks like a journalist because they're also on Twitter and they're on social media. I think journalism is alive and thriving in this country, and I see that here in this beautiful faculty of political science and journalism at the University of Zagreb under the direction of Dr. Tenip Harrison, who's a master at trying to help young students figure out why they should be in this business, what role they need to have in society, and how to navigate a very difficult time for journalism in this country.
Going forward and looking into the future, what would you say are the biggest challenges we as journalists are facing, and how can we go forward from that?
I'm going to let Jake tackle that first. He's younger than I am. He probably knows what the better challenges are that are out there.
I mean, I think that they're obvious. The two biggest challenges are a lack of sustainable revenue and a lack of public trust. And I would like to think that solving both problems can be done simultaneously. I think that if there's a way that journalists can persuade the public that what they do matters, that what they do is done with integrity, and that what they do is valuable, then audiences will trust it and as a result will support it.
And building on that, which goes right into the level of trust, we have to maintain our ethics. And so we're always, every day as journalists, challenged, even, do I put that piece of video on? Is it too bloody? Is it going to tell the story better? Does it offend the audience? All of those kinds of tough questions journalists have wrestled with for a long time in the newsroom. They're even tougher today because of this 24/7, non-stop, always on, environment in which we live. And, we have not yet taken the time to think about ethics codes related to this social media world. I mean, the Online News Association has them, people talk about them, but one day, it's already happened, but we're going to get really shocked because somebody with a smartphone, could be a journalist or could be an audience member, is going to be right in the middle of a terrorist event and will be broadcasting live, and we will have live death on the air. I mean, we've already had it in scattered spots, but there'll be a huge kind of event like that. And that will be a watershed moment that I don't think we've quite happened yet to help us think about what can we do so that we maintain this trust while still telling the story of very difficult, tough stories.
Thank you very much for coming here today and for having a conversation with us. I wish you luck on the end of your workshop, and we hope to see you again someday in the future.
Yeah.
Dragi gledatelji, to bi bilo sve za danas od emisije Spike. Ostanite i dalje uz program televizije Student.